Iran and Israel are on the path to war. Israel's defense minister warning that the strike on Iran will make the world understand Israel's might. What would an all-out war between Israel and Iran look like? How devastating could it be? And how will world powers react? We've got Afshon Ostovar, an associate professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, to answer those questions and more. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Afshon Ostovar joins us now, author of Wars of Ambition. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Afshon, there's no doubt Israel will strike, but just how will this war play out? And I think in order to answer that question, we first need to look at Israel and Iran and their military capabilities. How do they compare?
Well, in many ways, they're different, right? Israel is a small country in terms of population. It has a very large mobilized military because it's a all volunteer force. Everybody serves, so everybody's a potential. Most Israeli citizens can do something in the military. Iran is a conscript army, which means the vast majority of the people that fight are people that are doing 1 to 2 year tours. And don't necessarily specialize in anything. But the military capabilities are really different in terms of technological capability. So Israel is advanced in every element of military, from its aircraft to its missiles to its radar to everything. Its anti-air defense, all of it is state of the art in a lot of ways. Iran is a much more sort of hodgepodge of capabilities. Its most effective, most advanced capabilities are its missile force, which is its largest and most important, I think, offensive and defensive weapon. It has a large stockpile. Its weapons, its missiles can fly a long ways and hit targets from a great distance. Beyond that, Iran's military is a little shakier. In terms of infantry, defense, artillery, it's all very strong. But in terms of what it can do against Israel, it can't really deliver weapons to Israel outside of missiles and drones. Those are its two main categories. It doesn't have an air force that can survive an attack against Israel. Its air platforms are all very outdated. And it has advanced cyber capabilities and things like that. But really, when we're talking about Iran's military, when we're talking about offensive capabilities, it's basically their missiles and drones that are the main component.
And are they even effective? I mean, there are some reports that indicate that their missiles are actually quite inaccurate. And on top of that, we see that Israel has really decimated their proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. Do they have anything up their sleeve, so to speak?
Well, their missiles are effective, but remember, this is like throwing rocks, hundreds of yards away, right? If you hit your target, great, but it's just a rock, right? So the missiles are powerful explosives. But when you apply those powerful explosives to a very large military base, let's say, that's in the middle of the desert, if you miss by 10 yards, which is not very far if you're talking about, 1,000 miles, but if you miss by 10 yards, you hit sand as opposed to a building, right? And so that makes them appear ineffective. But if they were to hit, let's say, an apartment building, they would be devastating, right? So Iran's military attacks so far with its missile attacks against Israel have been largely ineffective in terms of the damage that they've been able to inflict on Israel. But they have shown that they can penetrate Israel's air defenses, right? So let's say in the last attack, Iran shot about 180 ballistic missiles, something like that, and about 30 got through. That's not a huge proportion, but if you multiply that, let's say, across several attacks, and let's say those attacks aren't aimed at a military base in the middle of the desert, but they're aimed at Tel Aviv or Haifa or Jerusalem, and they're landing on civilian targets, then those 30 missiles could be really devastating to civilian populations. Not necessarily devastating in terms of a military strategic impact, but definitely they could have a much more serious toll. When it comes to proxies, you're absolutely right. I mean, Iran's main weapon against Israel, and the main reason why it's in this war with Israel is through its support to Hezbollah and Hamas primarily, but also to other proxies outside of Lebanon and Gaza. And Hamas is basically decimated, and Hezbollah is increasingly weakened. Hezbollah still has weapons. They still have rockets. They still have missiles. They still have drones. They just hit Netanyahu's house the other day with a drone. It didn't do much damage, but the idea is that they still have these weapons, right? So they can still be used to some effect, but the effect that they were intended to have, which is an overwhelming kind of blanketing of rockets and missiles on Israeli population centers, doesn't seem to be something that Iran can count on any longer.
Now, given their military capabilities and what you just pointed out here, what types of scenarios do you see here in terms of the type of war that will play out?
Well, this is a weird war. If we go back to my analogy about throwing rocks, right? This is like people who live in the same neighborhood, but they're not neighbors, right? They're 4 or 5 houses away. And basically what they can do to each other is throw rocks, right? Now, Iran can only throw rocks from its own backyard. Israel can get closer, let's say to the neighbor's yard, and throw rocks from there. That is to say, they can use their jets, their aircraft. They can get closer to Iran and they can fire missiles from closer to Iran and hit Iran from there. But still, they're fighting a long distance away, right? So what is strange about this war is that it is not a war that either side can easily win. That's to say, you cannot defeat the other side. What you can do is get the other side to quit, or to get the other side to say, okay, please stop, we'll compromise, which is essentially quitting, right? So Israel's intention, I assume, is going to be to get Iran to quit. And if they can't get Iran to quit, then in the meantime, they're going to try to do as much damage to Iran's military and perhaps other forms of infrastructure. The longer the war goes on, then the question sort of remains of how it can expand. But let's say they start with the military. They're going to try to do as much damage to Iran's military as possible, so that even if Iran doesn't quit, it has less to use against Israel in the future.
And how do you see this impacting everyday civilians on both sides when it comes to just everyday life?
Well, it's not good in any way, right? I mean, war is not a good thing for anybody. It really depends how the war plays out, right? So right now, Israel's war against Hamas and Hezbollah has heavily involved civilian infrastructure, right? They're hitting apartment buildings, they're hitting hospitals, they're hitting schools, because that's where Hamas and Hezbollah's weapons and headquarters tend to be, is buried under civilian infrastructure and houses. Iran doesn't have that problem because Iran is a huge country. It's not a small country. So its military, its weapons, its storehouses are all dispersed all across Iran. Some of them are hidden under mountains. Some of them are in the middle of the desert. Some of them are accessible for Israel. Some of them would be really hard for Israel to hit. So in that sense, if it stays to military targets, at least on the Iranian side, then Iranian civilians will probably be left out of it. Now, if Israel intends to attack Iranian leadership, then they could be attacking housing in Tehran or other places where these leaders might either be living or might be living underground underneath someplace in an urban setting, right? And if they hit civilian targets in Iran, then you would suspect that would open up Iran to retaliate against civilian targets in Israel. That's my worry, is that this war expands to civilian targets, because once that happens, then people on both sides are going to suffer greatly. If it stays to military targets, then people are going to suffer, but they're mostly going to be people in uniform.
Yeah, speaking of that, I spoke to an Israeli insider who said everyone's kind of anticipating and guessing, speculating, are we going to strike military targets, Israel? Are they going to strike the nuclear or the oil? And he said to me, listen, it's not about one strike. It's not going to be one strike and we're out. This is going to be a long war. And Israel's goal is not necessarily regime change. It's to make sure that Iran is not a nuclear power. And he also said that Israel has quite a few surprises for Iran. What's your reaction to that in terms of this playing out to a long war that's not one strike and we're done?
Yeah, you anticipate if Israel strikes, and it's a big strike, that Iran is going to respond and you're going to get into a cycle of warfare. That's probably not going to be fast and furious because it takes time to plan these things and to conduct these things. Neither side can do this indefinitely, right? Iran only has so many missiles. It has thousands of missiles, but it only has so many missiles. And Israel only has so much missile defense, right? So every time that Iran fires missiles, it's expending missile defense against it, right? And those things don't just grow on trees. They take a long time to sort of build. So neither side can do this forever. But you would anticipate that if this isn't a retaliatory strike by Israel, but rather this is an escalation in the war, and Israel is intending to do serious damage against the Islamic Republic and the Revolutionary Guards, then they can't just hit a few drone factories or missile factories and feel like it's a done deal, right? They could do that, but that would basically set them back a year, 2 years, not really significant. My sense is that Israel sees this war post October 7th as an existential conflict, right? And if you take Iran's leaders at their word, then this is exactly what they wanted Israel to feel, right? They wanted Israel to feel that it was under an existential threat, right? So now the Islamic Republic is learning, perhaps, what it means to actually put Israel in an existential situation. And if Israel really feels that's in an existential threat, then it could have the will and desire to follow this war a long ways. And ultimately, the longer the war goes, you would imagine that the nuclear facilities would be involved, right? But it's not easy to attack those things, right? It's one thing to say that they can attack them. It's another thing to actually attack them in a way that actually destroys them, right? Or puts them offline. And when you attack nuclear facilities, there's spillage, radiation escapes, right? You have a huge humanitarian crisis potentially, on hand. So it's not a simple or easy thing to just do that, right? So my guess is, without having any sense, other than what Israeli officials have said, any sense of what their actual planning is that they're going to do this in stages, and that it's going to be as much of an evolving conflict as it will be a deliberate one, right? So they're going to strike, they're going to see how Iran responds, and then they're going to strike again, and we will see how the war goes. But I think the problem with war is that everybody has a plan, right? But those plans can always change because war is dynamic, war is ugly, war is crazy. And if Iran starts raining down bombs on Haifa or Tel Aviv or whatever, that could change Israel's calculus. It could make them harden. It could draw on the United States. It could draw on Europe. Or it could also make them say, listen, the Israeli people don't need to suffer this either. Maybe we can take a bit of a win and slow down. I really have no idea where this is going. I think this is the problem with this conflict now. I mean, this is a conflict that I've been predicting for a long time because I feel that, Iran put Israel in such a situation that at some point it was going to blow up. October 7th happened to be that point. So I feel like in many ways, this war was bound to happen. But now that it's happening, I don't think we can really draw on history or past experience to give us guideposts of where it's headed. I think it's going to be a dynamic, evolving situation, and we'll see where it goes.
Wow, it looks like it could potentially be a devastating, long war with long-term consequences, like you said. And what about the region at large? We're hearing from the U.S. government saying that there's evidence to prove that there's North Korean troops fighting on behalf of the Russians. How do you see Iran's allies and Israel's allies playing into this conflict?
Well, this is one of those question marks, right? So Iran's allies are basically its clients, its proxies, and the main proxies are let's say indisposed at the moment, right? Like Hamas is offline, and Hezbollah is fighting its own existential war against Israel.
What about Russia and China?
So Russia and China, I mean, this is a difficult thing, right? So Russia and China can't just get involved on Iran's side. They can do things at, let's say, the UN Security Council level. They can block things or support things on Iran's behalf that help Iran in a way. That's what they've been doing in the past. They've shielded Iran from international pressure in some ways. But they can't easily tip the balance by supporting Iran. I mean, for one, there's really no benefit to them, right? Like if China or Russia get involved outwardly to help Iran, they're not going to gain much from it, right? What China needs from the Middle East more than anything is hydrocarbons. They need oil and gas, and they get that from the Arabs already. They get it from Iran too, but if Iran didn't exist tomorrow, they would still have it from the Saudis and from the Emiratis and from the Qataris. The prices might go up, but they would still have it, right? The Russians don't need hydrocarbons. What the Russians need is military support for their war in Ukraine. Iran has been providing that military support. But Russia isn't really in the position to now support Iran too, right? Russia is already sort of needing Iran on its side. So neither of them have a clear path to helping Iran. They can help Iran in the international space, but they can't really help Iran in a military way. Now, the longer this lasts, the more complicated it gets. You know, you could see North Korean troops in Iran in some convoluted, future sort of hellscape where the world is at war. I wouldn't rule it out, but there's no, I think, obvious path to having Russians or Chinese or anybody helping Iran at the moment.
How do you suppose the Arab states would react, or even a country like Turkey, NATO, and they have all these harsh words and criticisms for Israel, but would they go beyond their rhetoric?
Yeah, this is a strange thing. If this war happened, let's say 4 years ago, then I think Saudi Arabia, the UAE would be much more on board with Israel in this conflict. But Saudi Arabia and the UAE decided after Iran was able to give weapons to the Houthis that were able to reach both the Saudis and the Emiratis, and after Iran struck the Saudis directly with their own weapons, Saudi Arabia and UAE decided this feud with Iran is just not helpful. It's not good for us, right? We don't want to be involved in a war. We don't want missiles dropping in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. We want an off-ramp here. Iran has essentially asserted itself in the region. It's strong. It's powerful. We don't have the wherewithal or the desire to fight Iran the way that it's fighting us, right? So let's just make peace with Iran, and then we'll get rich and we'll live our best lives. And Iran can do whatever it wants in Syria and Iraq, and we'll just sort of, stay out of it, right? Now the war that they wanted is finally happening, right? This is the war that they wanted, even prior to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, right? But now it's happening. But it's happening in this really uncomfortable context of the war in Gaza. And so Arab populations are really not sympathetic to Israel. Even if they don't like Iran, they are not sympathetic to Israel. So there's not a groundswell of support, and there's not even really tepid support for Israel at the ground level in any of these countries. The elites, I think, are a little more mixed. If you were to give them a future scenario where Israel is what it is and the Islamic Republic disappears, and Iran becomes a nicer, gentler, or less aggressive neighbor, I think they would take it. But I don't think they want to take it under the current circumstances. And they certainly don't want to be a party to what feels like to them an extension of the Gaza war, right? If Israel had on October 8th, instead of going into Gaza, gone against Iran, I think it would have been a different story. But in the context it is now, I think it's too complicated for them.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And can you give me some numbers in terms of Iran's capabilities for their missiles and weapons, and where they're getting it from, actually, too?
So most of I can't give you numbers off the top of my head, but the missiles and are in the thousands, the drones are in the tens of thousands. But Iran produces it themselves. This is what ever since the Iran-Iraq war, when Iran basically was at the mercy of foreign suppliers for its military, it has devoted, most of its energies that aren't expended outside of Iran to developing its military industrial base, and in very specific ways that they thought would give them an advantage over their neighbors. And so they invested really heavily in missiles and drones. So they produce it themselves. They have a lot of it, and the materials they mostly get through various channels. China is a big supplier, right? So this is an indirect way that China and Russia help Iran, is with parts, electronics, industrial materials, that sort of thing. So they can continue to produce these stuff. But if Israel is able to take, let's say, the factories offline, then Iran wouldn't easily be able to replenish, right? And so this is, one of those aspects of the war is that Iran right now can build a lot of missiles, so much so that it feels comfortable and confident that it can supply drones and missiles to Russia and to other countries, even in the midst of its own sort of conflict with Israel. But at some point, it's going to max out, and it's going to need everything that it has.
And like you mentioned before, Iran and Israel don't share a border with each other. And so how would that affect the Iranian military per se in terms of getting involved in the conflict and how they fight the war?
Well, this is the thing, is that you can only really fight it two ways. Iran can fight it by launching missiles and drones, or they can fight it by proxy. And those proxies can only launch missiles and drones. Hezbollah has been launching, its rockets and drones for a year, right? And it's going to continue to do that. But Israel has found a way to sort of deal with that. What we haven't seen, at least not in large numbers, we've seen it in small numbers, is Iran's proxies in Iraq and Syria really get involved. The proxies in Iraq have missiles. They have missiles that can reach Israel, and they have drones that can reach Israel. I don't know how many they have. They could have hundreds, they could have thousands, or they could have tens. But they do have some, right? So you would suspect that they would, that if Iran is really under attack, that they would use these things at some point. But they have a finite capacity, right? At some point, these things are gone. And every time that a weapon fires from Iraq or Syria or Yemen against Israel, Israel bombs those sites in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So they're not risk-free either. This puts Iran in a really sort of strange position because it can't actually take the war to Israel. It can expand in various ways. It can do things in the oceans. It can launch its missiles not at Israel, but let's say at U.S. forces in the region, in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Syria. Its proxies could do the same thing. Its proxies could launch the missiles at Arab states if Arab states allow Israeli jets to fly over. But all of this expands the conflict in a way that doesn't benefit Iran, right? So Iran can sort of use it as a punitive measure against Israel's allies or bystanders, but it can't really use it in any strategic way to win the war against Israel specifically, right? And that really limits what Iran can do.
And you're in the United States. How do you see the outcome of the U.S. elections impacting or shaping the nature of this war?
It's a little difficult to say because the Biden administration is I think, an easier administration to understand. The Trump administration, obviously, as it was in the past, is very unique to sort of the whims and desires of the president or the former President Trump. Trump is, for all of his bluster when it comes to Iran, he has proven himself to be not inclined towards conflict, right? Every opportunity that he had to respond to Iran's aggression, military aggression, he chose not to respond to Iran's military aggression, right? So Iran's military fired ballistic missiles at U.S. forces in Iraq after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. The United States didn't respond, right? I think in any other administration, the U.S. would have responded to that. So that makes Trump, I think, more of a wild card. And in Iran, even if it doesn't trust Trump, might benefit from a Trump administration in a way that they probably wouldn't benefit from a continuation of a Democratic administration, because the Democrats tend to be more predictable. They tend to follow sort of a predictable path of foreign relations. And while neither, I think, the Republicans nor the Democrats want a war with Iran, the Democrats, I think, follow a path that is more likely to include assistance to Israel that is something that we could sort of predict, whereas Trump himself, I think, is unpredictable. That being said, Trump has surrounded himself with a lot of real Iran hawks, and their intentions, obviously, I think, would be to probably do more against Iran than what the Biden administration is willing to do.
Yeah, we spoke with his national security, former national security advisor, John Bolton, and he actually said that with Donald Trump, they would have a saying, it's never final until it's final, and then when it's final, it's still not final.
Right.
And just to conclude, there are reports and allegations out that Israel is delaying its response to Iran as a result of supposed leaks. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, honestly, I have no idea. My guess is that Israel is taking time, to devise a plan to attack Iran in a way that's meaningful to their strategic ends, right? And not just devise an attack, but also get all their ducks in order for Iran's retaliation. Not just one, strike, but multiple strikes. If they really intend for this conflict to last months and not just be concluded with a retaliatory strike, then they're probably, working on plans that will allow them to continue and face all the contingencies that they sort of anticipate. So I don't know how much plans matter. Whatever's been leaked, I don't think it's been terribly important. And really, it's no surprise that Israel wants to attack Iran. They've been saying it. And it's no surprise how they're going to do it. They can do it one of two ways. They can launch missiles from Israel, or they can fly their jets right up to Iran's border, or even across Iran's border and fire missiles that way. So there's no real secret. They could use subs and fire missiles from subs. But really, whatever happens to Iran is going to come from missiles or bombs. It's unlikely that Israel is going to land ground forces and do anything on the ground. Special forces at a certain time, possibly, but not in any numbers that would be like an invasion.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight and expertise. We really appreciate it. That's Afshon Ostovar, author of Wars of Ambition.
Thanks so much.
Hit the like button, leave a comment, and give us a review. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.